Good afternoon. It's Jennifer Bruton back with you to share a little bit more in terms of your review that you've been taking and turning in for Test 2. There's been a little bit of confusion, so I want to clear up some of the items that were on the review to make sure that you understand it before you take your test. I'm also going to be changing on the test. There's a musical selection that didn't play. There was a broken link, so I'm going to fix that this afternoon. The first question refers to the various classes of people that we encounter in the Middle Ages, and you need to understand the differences between the clergy, the nobility, and the peasants. The clergy were those who worked in the churches and monasteries. The priests, they were the ones that had access to knowledge, to education, to books, the things that ordinary people didn't have access to. Many of you mentioned something about a middle class. There's really no middle class during this time period. Middle class is something that evolves later when we get to the Industrial Revolution and we have a working class of people that move to urban centers. So right now, either you're born really rich or you're born really poor, and there's not a whole lot in between. Some of the wealthy classes and even maybe some of the peasants may have eventually found their way to being within the churches and serving in that way, but pretty much wherever you were born was where you stayed. If you were born poor, unfortunately, you stayed poor. And the peasants were very uneducated. They were illiterate. They didn't have access to any sort of learning or education materials. So make sure that you understand the difference between those classes. The next question had to do with instruments in this time period. Instruments were not used in the churches. Remember, further down in your review, you have a term called a cappella, which means music that is unaccompanied, only voices. They believed in this time period that the voices were sacred, and that was what was used in churches. Only voices, and they started out with very, very simple chants. So that goes on to the question about texture. Monophonic texture means that very simple one melodic line, and that's how chant began. So chant is not just a generic term for something that we speak in rhythm. The chant in this time period is specific, and it's sacred music of the church in Latin, part of the worship service. Another thing along those lines is the influence of Pope Gregory. You need to go back and look through your chapter and see exactly how Pope Gregory was involved. I'll give you a hint. He didn't write all the chants from this time period. So check him out in the chapter and make sure you understand his contributions. The next person of significance was Hildegard of Bingen. Most of you understood about her. You must have read about her in the chapter, so you did pretty well on that section. Good job. So the next thing were definitions. I'm going to scroll down on my screen and look at those. One that you all defined pretty well was the Mass, which is a liturgical or service portion of worship in the Catholic Church. The Mass has two parts, the proper and the ordinary. The proper changes depending on the time of year or the feast day or special celebrations, but the ordinary stays the same and it's done the same way every day. There are 5 parts to the ordinary of the Mass, and those are listed in your textbook, and you need to know all of those because they're very influential in the history of music. The setting of the Mass happens for years and years. As a matter of fact, it doesn't change much until we get to the 1960s, so it's a very, very long tradition, and you need to know about that. The morality plays, there's a specific one in your chapter, and it's related to one of the names on your review, so you need to know about that. Word painting is something that we get as we move into the Renaissance, which, remember, comes right after the Middle Ages. The music of the Renaissance becomes a little bit more complicated, and we do have the use of some instruments primarily in secular music, music outside of the church. One of the primary forms is the Italian madrigal, and then later the English madrigal. So you need to understand the definition of that term and the kind of song that is represented by that term. Lute songs are specific also to a certain country and a very specific composer, so most of you got that right. The Reformation is a very significant development in the era of the church in this time period. The church goes through a big split. And what happens during the Reformation is that we have the evolution of Protestant churches. We have Martin Luther and sort of a revolt that happens against some of the things happening in the Catholic Church. what comes out of that are different traditions, Christian traditions, where then the music begins to be done in the language of the people instead of just in Latin as it was in the Catholic Church. So all of those developments are very significant to the music that we'll be studying that comes later on. I hope this is helpful, and I hope you do well on your tests, so good luck.